Yeah, as Jim mentioned, I'm going to have kind of two parts to the talk, and I'll explain that a little more. But just to get us started, I wanted to put up some recent headlines of newspaper coverage of philanthropy in education. And what you'll notice is you're not seeing the sort of old story that you might have read 10, 15 years ago of a nice celebratory announcement of a new $15 million grant and pretty short, move on from there. A lot of it is now focusing on the political influence of these funders. And this is particularly pronounced in education philanthropy. And these are coming from news sources like the New York Times and the Charlotte Observer. And what I'm trying to do in my work, and what I'll talk about today, is sort of look behind the story about what's happening here, what's really changing about education philanthropy, and what can we say about its intersection with politics. And there will be two parts to my talk. And the first, I'm putting the newer stuff first. So the first part of the talk is some more recent work I've done that goes beyond what's in the book, including new data that I've collected from 2010 on major foundation grants and where they're going. And I'm particularly interested in the evolution of the strategies that major funders are using over the course of the past decade. And then I'll move on to focus on the research in my book, which focuses on the local political context. When you're talking about education, politics, and policy, you really can't quite see the full process play out unless you look at the place where so many of the decisions are still being made, and that's at the local level. And part of what I argue is that different political contexts seem to lead to very different types of outcomes when philanthropy is involved. So starting with this big national story, to set the context, if you go back to the early 2000s, you're kind of in the aftermath of the huge $500 million Annenberg Challenge, a massive philanthropic investment, which left a lot of people saying, was this all there was? That it didn't quite lead to the big, broad effects in policy that many people had hoped for. And it led to a lot of soul searching and arguments that philanthropists needed to invest in higher leverage strategies. They needed to target their money more and find ways to make sure that it would have a greater impact for these sides of the investment that they made. And I would argue that there are two big trends that you can see playing out in the decade or so since the Annenberg Challenge. And one of these would be foundations particularly would describe what they're doing as investing in the competition, that you've had a big growth in the sector of organizations that compete with the public school district in various ways, or the broader public sector in education. So this includes charter schools, most obviously, but it also includes organizations that do things like alternative teacher certification, like Teach for America, so competing with the traditional model of teacher preparation. You could also say, though, looking at the education or the politics literature more generally, that there's a jurisdictional challenge going on here, that it's not only a strategy in terms of reform, but it's also some competition over control of education, and that it's, in a sense, creating a parallel system of actors that can provide their own framework for how students should be educated, how teachers should be prepared. And we're seeing a lot of the political battles play out between these two sets of actors. Secondly, the pattern that I'm observing over the last decade or so is convergence. And this is essentially funders increasingly overlapping in their strategies and who they're giving their grants to. And the funders might particularly point to the fact that they're adopting strategic philanthropy, that this is part of their effort to be more disciplined about measuring results and outcomes in data. And as they're doing this, they're adopting similar approach of strategic grant making and perhaps being drawn to the same grantees. But I would also argue that there's an institutional theory side of this story, that if you go back to the legitimacy challenge, in a sense, posed by the aftermath of the Annenberg Challenge, you'd expect some imitation, some mimetic processes. How are we going to rebuild legitimacy in our sector and show that we can do this better? And that I think the rush to strategic philanthropy in some sense might be a function of that imitation process playing out. So the data that I look at comes from the 15 largest K-12 grant makers. So these are the biggest funders. I took the top 15 for each of 3 years, 2000, 2005, and 2010. It's a very familiar list of names: Gates Foundation, Broad Foundation, Walton Family Foundation, Annenberg, Ford, Kellogg, Dell. And I collected these from the 990 PF, so the tax returns that are filed where they report every grant that they distributed in that year. And I cast basically as wide a net I could to get every grant that in some way dealt with K-12 education. So it's not higher ed and it's not pre-K, but everything that dealt with K-12 education to any type of organization. So first of all, I'm looking here at this shift in terms of traditional institution versus the jurisdictional challenge or the competitive organizations. And so on this side over here, you have public schools, state departments of education, and universities. Blue bars represent the share of grant dollars out of the 2000 data, red is 2005, and green is 2010. And you can see for each of those sectors, a decline in the share of grant dollars that they were receiving over that time, definitely most pronounced for public schools and state departments of education. I include universities in this category, particularly because of the role they play in the traditional teacher training. On the other side, you have charter schools. This includes individual charters as well as charter management organizations. Teacher training and recruitment is going to be Teach for America, but also other alternative certification organizations. School leadership training includes alternative certification for principals. An organization would be New Leaders for New Schools. And then lastly, there's venture capital. And these are some very new organizations. Here in California, you got New Schools Venture Fund. And they're organizations that kind of collect philanthropic dollars and then reinvest those dollars in other organizations, many of which are charter schools. So I'm capturing the money that's going to New Schools Venture Fund and those types, but coming from Gates and Broad and other major funders. And you can see in those sectors just pronounced growth. And I think particularly noteworthy is the mirror image from public schools to charters, where charters are getting about the same share in 2010 that public schools were getting back in 2000. So I think that really speaks to the, to the shift that has occurred and how uniform it is. So next, I'm looking at convergence with this same data. And I'm just going to take a moment and define what I mean by convergence and how I identified it. So convergence is, I'm looking for the overlapping grant making. When are the funders giving to the same organizations? And the way I identified it is pretty straightforward. I would just look at grantees that received more than one major foundation grant. So if you take Green Dot Public Schools, a charter school organization here in Los Angeles, if they got grants from Gates and Broad, then I would include them in this group as a convergent grantee. And if you only got one major foundation grant, then you're not included. So in 2000, 23% of all the funds in my data went to organizations that got more than one major foundation grant. So all the rest, about 3/4, they're only getting one from any given major foundation. In 2005, that grew to 35%, so modest growth. In 2010, it was 64. So here you see the really big jump. About 2/3 of major foundation grant dollars in 2010 went to grantees that got more than one major foundation grant. And to kind of further illustrate the shift that has occurred, I'm going to show you the top 3 grantees amongst these convergent grantees for each year. So in 2000, at most, it was only 2 or 3 major funders converging on a single grantee. One example is the Annenberg Challenge in Detroit. So a lot of the Annenberg Challenge sites were the ones that would attract funds from multiple major funders. And for the most part, you're looking at organizations that primarily work in partnership with public schools. In 2005, you can see a little bit of a shift. We have 3, 4, or 5 major funders converging on these organizations. Some that are more associated here with state government, but also New Schools Venture Fund shows up. So you have the newer sector more focused on charter organizations starting to pop up in 2005. And you can also see the grant dollars getting a little bit larger. These are comparable. I've adjusted everything for 2010 dollars here. But the real change, again, is in 2010. So in 2010, the 3 top ones are Charter School Growth Fund, Teach for America, and KIPP. So all of them are associated with either charter schools or, in Teach for America's case, alternative certification. But there's also the really striking degree of convergence. You have Teach for America got grants from 13 out of the 15 major funders that year. So only Kellogg and Ford broke the model and did not give to Teach for America in 2010. KIPP, it was 9. And you can also see how large the dollar amounts have grown in 2010 dollars by that time. So additionally on this convergence story, I wanted to not only look at the top, but to try to understand how it looks from a field level perspective, that there's clearly a lot of organizations that have overlapping funders. And some of them aren't receiving these, quite as many grant dollars as these other organizations. And I also have some ideas I'm working out about what is implied by a shared funding relationship, that it's not just that you have the same major funders, but that you're probably under similar pressures for how you're evaluated and what you need to report and what's expected of you as a grantee, especially if you share 3 or 4 or 5 major funders. And that on the other side, you might also get some networking opportunities that come out of being, having similar funders. And for this network, I did set the parameters for convergence a little higher to really capture where there was a lot of overlap for these grantees. So to be included in this network, they had to have at least $2 million in grants, but they had to share at least 3 major funders. So it would have to be Gates, Broad, and Walton, or Hewlett, Ford, and Carnegie. Some combination, any combination of 3 major funders. So first I'm going to show you 2005. And here you can see 2 separate clusters of grantees that share at least 3 major funders with each other. So what you're looking at here, for example, down at the bottom, you have New Visions for Public Schools, a New York City-based nonprofit that partners with the public school district and opens new schools. And you have Boston Plan for Excellence, also a nonprofit that partners with the public schools there. They share a link, so they share at least 3 major funders. And New Visions has the larger circle. That means they're getting more money. The larger the circle, the more grant dollars they receive. Up here in this separate cluster, you see more of the charter or school choice oriented groups. Those thicker lines, like between New Schools Venture Fund and KIPP, they share more than 3 major funders. So the thicker the line means there's more. And you can see, the separate groups, the more public school oriented, the more market oriented, and somewhat different groups of funders. This is primarily Gates, Carnegie, and Annenberg creating the links between these groups. And up here, it's Gates, Broad, and Walton. So Gates is in both. They're so large, but otherwise it's slightly different. Now I'm going to show you 2010, and it looks quite different. So this is the 2010 network. And first of all, what obviously emerges is that there's no distinguishable clusters of any kind. Everything is somehow connected. And also, that cluster that was up at the top has really kind of moved to the center of the network, right here. So KIPP, Teach for America, New Schools Venture Fund, these groups are at the center, and they're sharing a lot of major funders, and a lot of major funders with a lot of other organizations that work in similar ways, maybe on creating new charter schools or supporting charter schools in some way, or school choice. And this, again, is Gates, Broad, and Walton, but also a lot of other new funders kind of adopting this strategy and giving grants to the same organizations, like the Robertson Foundation would be an example. And then to the extent that you have, I guess, a more traditional sector represented, it would be down here with some of the universities and the Carnegie Foundation for Advancement in Teaching. And that's where you see Hewlett and Carnegie is more in that cluster. But basically, the big story is that everything is connected and that this is the core part of the network. So I'm beginning to think through some of the implications for this and also exploring this for future work. But I think on the one hand, what we're seeing is a story about how foundations are becoming more influential in education policy, that this is effective from the perspective of how can you be high leverage. By being overlapping and by basically pooling resources, these organizations that they invest in can grow faster, can be more influential in policy. And the fact that the agenda has somewhat narrowed towards choice and charter schools also heightens the prominence of that agenda. Some questions I have are about the sort of unintended consequences and implications of this, that whether there are new groups or new innovations that fall off the radar as this becomes a bigger part of the picture, especially when you get down there to 64% of overlapping grants. And then what I would add to that is that with strategic philanthropy, you have this approach that's so heavily focused on what you can measure and being able to have data to show that those investments pay off and looking for social return on investment. And that there are a lot of strategies in education reform that are harder to measure, that may not be tied to student test scores. And that when you have both overlap and strategic grant making, that those might be the things that particularly lose out. Something like political organizing or community organizing would be an example. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit to this, the political story that I looked at in New York City and Los Angeles. And this is drawing on the research from my book. So on the one hand, we have this big national story, but it's obviously playing out in all of these local political contexts. And the question that I'm really interested in is what happens in the longer term? So a foundation gets invested, they give some grants to nonprofit organizations, but what's happening after 5 years go by? And especially, or 10 years. And when you think about the fact that funders often leave or change strategies, that a lot of this depends on whether these things take on a life of their own. And the way I selected my cases started with some analysis I did to look at which characteristics of school districts predict where funders were giving the most money. So I created a model. It's in the book, but I'll talk you through it right here, that I looked at the 100 largest school districts, and I had characteristics like poverty and graduation rate, actually the density of nonprofit organizations. And the factor that I found to be most important for explaining where grant dollars were going was actually this governing factor. Districts with mayoral or state control get a lot more money. That is very important. So top grant recipients include New York City, Chicago, Oakland, Boston. None of these districts have elected school boards. In each case, the mayor is appointing a board, appointing the person in charge of the schools, or the state is in control, as is the case in New Orleans. Los Angeles emerges as kind of this exception, where there's a lot of philanthropic activity and an elected school board. And I thought it would be quite interesting to compare what I saw as sort of the dominant strategy to something that's different. So I looked at New York and LA. They also conveniently are the two largest school districts. So I thought they would be a great way to kind of examine these questions. And the way I did this, I did surveys and interviews in 2008 and 2009 in both cities, with a little bit of follow-up in 2012 before the book came out. So a little bit more about this question I'm asking about reform sustainability. it's not just a question for education reform about philanthropy and the fact that philanthropy doesn't always have a long timeline. There's just a more general literature about policy churn in education reform, and that you have superintendent turnover, you have just a lot of questions about whether a strategy ever has time to take hold and be fully implemented in a school district, given the sort of faddishness of school reform and the turnover of school leaders. On the other hand, in political science, there's a lot of work on policy feedback. And so that's this idea that policies, when they do take hold and when they do become sustained and implemented over the long haul, it's often because they generate some kind of positive feedback in the political system. They create a constituency or create something that's going to keep them in place and support them. And some of the research that looks at what builds positive feedback looks at a few factors, such as, are there constituencies that invest in the new policy? So whether it's a financial investment or an investment of political capital, who is recognizing a benefit from the policy and making that investment. And also, does the policy change interest group identities? And here, you might look to something like, who were the opponents of the policy, and they either become weakened, or does their identity in relation to the policy adjust and they find things about it that they like? Or do alignments between interest groups change? And I mean, a big question here, and something I'll talk a little about, is the role of unions, which is always a big question in education reform. And unions are often singled out as an opponent, and they're a group where you'd wonder, sort of, is there something that can shift the way the union relates to the policy to make them more of an investor or to weaken them in relation to the changes? So New York City and LA have some similarities and some differences. I mentioned, of course, mayoral control. And in New York City, the form of mayoral control, which was put in place when Bloomberg first took office in 2002, is quite top-down. The mayor can appoint the school's chancellor, also appoints the majority of this education policy board, and can remove those members at will. So the mayor is basically in charge of everything from a governing standpoint. Here in Los Angeles, there was the attempt at mayoral control with Villaraigosa in 2006, but really it's been consistently governed by the elected board. In terms of the strategies, there are some similarities, although the strategies look different from more of a surface level perspective. So in New York City, the school reform strategy that began under Bloomberg and his first chancellor, Joel Klein, in 2002, is basically a portfolio district strategy. So they are systematically closing low-performing schools and opening new schools. And those new schools that are being opened, initially they were open mostly in partnership with nonprofits that would create new small schools. But they've shifted that a little bit in recent years to start opening more charter schools. So those new small schools were traditional public schools with a nonprofit partner. The charter schools are charters run by a nonprofit on the charter model. Here in Los Angeles, it's really been charter schools throughout, many of which are operated by charter management organizations. So these larger nonprofits that oversee a whole system of charter schools, some of which are large enough to resemble small school systems in their own right, but fully managed by a nonprofit organization. So the money in each of the districts kind of matches up with these strategies. So this is from my data. I'm looking across all those 15 major funders that I have, and I pinpointed money that goes to particular sectors in each of the 2 school districts for 2005 and for 2010. So in New York City, you can see a fair amount of alignment between the public sector and philanthropy. That the reform strategy that the district developed was in many respects developed in partnership with philanthropists, and then philanthropists made investments that allowed the district to implement that strategy. So a good amount of funding went directly to the school district, where the school district was realigning itself to fit this new portfolio model. Quite a large share, particularly in 2005, went to the nonprofits. And this category, nonprofit service providers, includes the organizations that partnered to create new small schools. It includes principal training. There was an organization created for a new model to train principals, immediately had a contract with the district, and is now the main provider for that. So these are basically organizations that work in close partnership with the school district through implementation. Charter schools, you see that kind of show up in 2010 when the portfolio strategy made more of the shift to charter schools as the way to open new schools. And then the advocacy organization category includes organizations that represent a constituency in some way, generally getting a much smaller amount of money. Here in LA, it's basically all charters for the funding, and little to nothing going to LA Unified from the major funders. To give some examples here, advocacy organizations in LA are groups like Community Coalition and Inner City Struggle, and it is interesting to note that they get a little bit of a boost in 2010. So the results that I'm going to be reporting come from a survey as well as interviews that I conducted in both places. And the survey, basically, I captured each of those categories that I showed you in the last slide. So I surveyed individuals in the school district, particularly those who are most involved in the reform segments of the school district. So it would be people, say, working in LA Unified on charter schools. I surveyed the nonprofits that are receiving the grants. I surveyed charter organizations, advocacy organization leaders, but also union officials, and then any kind of leaders of parent organizations or parent representative bodies. I asked them about their attitudes towards politics and policy in both districts. And then I also built social networks to look at how they exchange information about education policy in each school district. The response rates for both were about 40%. And part of the reason I decided to focus on information exchange is the questions that I'm asking. I'm very interested in these coalition dynamics and these interest group alignments within the districts. And part of what I expected to find was that there would be an alignment between how groups shared information and their views of what is going on with education reform in the district. And my expectations for both were, I guess, fairly bleak in terms of policy sustainability. I was expecting fairly divided networks in both districts, that these are controversial reforms. They might be hard to get buy-in from a broad sector of groups. So I expected divided networks with attitudes, fairly closely linked to who you're sharing information with. And the two questions that I asked to get the network information, I asked where people got information about data and research related to education policy in the district. I also asked about where they got information on community needs and preferences. Today I'm going to focus on the first in the networks that I'm going to show you, but I'd be happy to talk about the others, and generally the findings for both line up with one another fairly well. So this is the New York City Policy Information Network. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on here. It's obviously kind of a complicated set of lines and circles that we have. So any link between two organizations shows that they share information, that someone in the survey responded, yes, I get information about data and research from this group. And the arrows show the direction of the flow. So you can see up there Gates Foundation and NYC DOE. NYC DOE is the school district central office. And then there's the Gates Foundation. There's an arrow pointing from Gates to NYC DOE, meaning that one of my district respondents said they get information about data and research from the Gates Foundation. So there's a directional flow from Gates to them. So in this survey, I don't have any Gates Foundation respondents. Yeah. So that I should add, this is a fully inclusive network where I'm including groups that, where I only know that they are a sender, but not necessarily know if they're a recipient. The color coding here is based on who is a foundation grantee, and I'll explain more about why I did that. But the gray nodes all indicate either funders or groups or institutions that got money from a major funder. And part of the reason I did that is as I began to analyze this network, it became clear that that was a key kind of dividing point in the network, that the groups that are major foundation grantees are fairly clustered together, and the groups that are not major foundation grantees are also fairly clustered together. So up there at the top around the Department of Education, most of the sources of information reported for the Department of Education included some organization that was a major foundation grantee, whether it was Gates itself, New Visions for Public Schools, the Aspen Institute, the New Teacher Project, all major foundation grantees. On the other hand, down here at the bottom, you see a number of black nodes. Those are all not major foundation grantees. The CECs, these are community education councils. They're bodies that represent parents. And nearly all of their sources of information include various organizations that do not get major foundation grants in my data. Similarly, over here, this is a cluster of community-based organizations, mostly in the Bronx and Brooklyn. Again, not very many major foundation grantees represented in that cluster of information sharing. One of the more interesting positions in the network is the union. This is the teachers union right here, the UFT. And you can see they're kind of between two clusters, and that kind of describes the political position and the role they've played. On the one hand, they've been behind Bloomberg's efforts at some points. They supported the renewal of mayoral control. There was a fair amount of, especially when Randy Weingarten was the president, she worked with the district quite a bit, but then they've also been opponents at times. But they shift their position a fair amount depending on the issue. Though in more recent times, they've been more of an opponent of the school district. So secondly, following with my expectations, I was interested in what does this look like for the attitudes that people have about education policy and politics. Are these divisions so stark that we're not really seeing anyone realign towards the new reforms or ideas? And in large part in New York, this was the case, that attitudes were quite divided and that those attitudes align fairly well with where different types of organizations are positioned in the network. So here I'm reporting this simply based on, these are all respondents who were district leaders or nonprofit leaders, the main foundation grant recipients in the network. And then these are the parents, the union leaders, and the advocacy organizations, which basically none of them were receiving major foundation grants. So you can see they had very different opinions on whether the school district was getting better. The district and nonprofit leaders mostly thought it was improving. Skipping down to this one, does the union obstruct efforts to reform the schools? District and nonprofit leaders felt that yes, it does. The parents, the unions, and the advocacy groups largely thought it did not. And that was the case even when I excluded the union respondents. And then whether community and advocacy organizations are shut out of education politics. The district and nonprofit leaders said, no, they're not shut out, whereas those groups largely said that they felt they are shut out. And again, a significant level of disagreement. The one thing I didn't find that was charter schools, but I'd say if I could go back and do this survey now, I would expect a significant difference today just because charters have become much more prominent on the agenda, and they were not as prominent at the time that I did this survey.
What did you do the survey?
This was from 2008. So now I'm going to look at Los Angeles. And I mentioned in my expectations, I expected fairly divided networks in both cases. Los Angeles defied my expectations. It's not really a divided network, and it's not really divided along any of the lines I might have expected, whether you're talking about who gets major foundation grants or who works in the charter sector or any sort of alignment along those political lines. Instead, there's a great deal of diversity in terms of who is sharing information with one another. So I'm going to talk again through sort of what this looks like and what's going on here. First of all, in the New York network, the gray nodes were foundation grantees. That's not the case here because there's no pattern really to where foundation grantees are located in this network. Instead, what I did was I found that this really resembles a core periphery structure in a network, which basically means there's a fairly dense core of organizations with a lot of cross-cutting ties between one another, a lot of information sharing between these organizations. In the periphery, it's less dense. There's not as, and so there's kind of, you can, basically I ran the model to identify the groups that would be in the core where the density is significantly higher. And this approximates the location of the core of this network where the highest density of information sharing is occurring. And what's really interesting to notice here is who's in the core. You have the Board of Education, you have LA Unified, so you have the school district represented. You have the Broad Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Annenberg Foundation. You have charter school organizations like Green Dot and the LA Alliance. You have community-based organizations like Community Coalition and Inner City Struggle. So amongst all of these groups, there's a huge amount of interaction across these sectors and across basically where you might expect political divisions, you're not really seeing it. The one key thing is UTLA. The union is not in the core. They are outside. And I think that is part of the story here about what distinguishes LA politically, is that the union has kind of not been along with this group that's in the middle. So again, I looked at the reflection of this in terms of attitudes. And once again, I just did not find the divisions that I found in New York City. And here I use the core periphery to distinguish between the two groups to see if there might be any differences between the two. But I looked at other cuts as well, and there's not a clear attitudinal divide between different groups in LA. So no significant differences across these questions, including charter schools, where I would most expect to find more polarization in Los Angeles. I mean, a little bit more support in the core for growing more charter schools. Where I do find a divide, and I think this plays out in what you'd expect with the core periphery structure, this question about community advocacy organizations and parents being shut out of education politics. In the core, they disagreed. Of course not, they're not shut out, they're in the center. But the groups in the periphery did agree, and I think that reflects the fact that they have a somewhat more marginal position in relation to the other groups and how well connected they feel in terms of sharing information. So building on this and trying to draw some conclusions from it, I think what has been playing out is New York has, on the one hand, with the incredible alignment of philanthropic resources and the public sector political capital and authority, you had kind of a sprint of policy development and implementation, and that alignment facilitated a lot of change that could happen fairly quickly and efficiently. And with the renewal of mayoral control, there was really no point when the agenda changed all that much. So you've had 140 schools closed or phased out and 589 open. That's pretty enormous change during Bloomberg's time. In New York City? Yeah. That's a terrific question. I don't know off the top of my head. Oh, how they, yeah. It would be well over 1,000. But yeah, the percentage would be important to, yeah. Yeah.
I need to know whether it's 10% or 50%.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. In terms of investments, and particularly the political investments, it's not just that those insiders are well connected to one another, that they share information. That's also where the political investment is coming from in these reforms. That those nonprofits that are closely linked to the district, sharing information, they're the ones who've invested and involved themselves in implementation of these strategies. You don't really see that happening from other parts of the education policy community, the advocacy organizations, the parents, partly because of the decision-making process. There wasn't really an avenue for them to be involved had they been supportive or interested in being involved. And as I showed you, there's this fairly divided network that has basically remained so as ongoing political battles have played out, whether it's additional school closures and people mobilizing to protest against those, lawsuits that have been raised to prevent school closures, again, just these dividing lines, the mayoral control battle, a lot of opposition from parents and advocacy groups about continuing mayoral control, even though it was continued. And now we have the 2013 mayoral election that just took place last week, the primary in any case. And here you had the candidate who won, Bill de Blasio, is the person on the ballot who arguably was the most opposed to Mayor Bloomberg, pretty much on everything, but including education. And his policy positions on education include capping charter schools, ending charter school location with public schools, stopping the policy of school closures. And you could definitely argue that education was not the most important issue. In a mayoral election, there's always many, many issues, and including issues besides Anthony Weiner in this case. But it is very consequential for what will happen in the future because the mayor has so much power in New York City over the schools. And so if de Blasio wins in the general election, he has just as much power as Bloomberg has had to create all these policies. He's in a pretty strong position to attempt to reverse course. And I think it speaks to the fact that this strategy has not built an obvious political constituency to be mobilized for an election or to try to see it carried forward as administrations change. In Los Angeles, I think everyone is kind of running a marathon instead of a sprint. And that speaks to the fact that things evolve more slowly here. And that's partly a function of the political institutions being very different, that things simply couldn't happen that fast. But looking at the interest group alignments, I mean, again, I think it's important to highlight just how diverse this coalition is, and that when these groups become aligned to actually work on an issue with one another, they're generally working towards this common idea of school-level autonomy. And that can be school-level autonomy in the context of charter schools, but you also see it in some of the policies that LA Unified has passed, school-level autonomy for public schools as well. And that seems to be the unifying thread where this agenda can capture a broader constituency that goes beyond the charter sector. So first you had the public school choice policy in 2009, which really did open the door for any organization, charter school, nonprofit, advocacy group, all sorts of groups to bid on running these low-performing LA Unified schools. That only lasted a couple of years until the MOU was adopted between the union and LA Unified. The union was really never thrilled with the idea that charter schools could bid on the public school choice process. And that, as a result, has led to the revision of public school choice. So now charter schools are no longer eligible to bid. But what you still have are these two strategies playing out of school-level autonomy in Los Angeles, and I would say still the potential to unite this diverse coalition. You have the very heavy philanthropic investment in charters, the fact that LA has more charter schools than any school district, the large number of CMOs continuing to work on expanding and adding new charters. But what you have where there's the potential for this broader coalition, and including teachers, is the development of pilot schools. And this process has basically opened the door for more pilot schools. So when a school goes through the process of public school choice, even now in the new model, teachers can put forward a plan and say, yes, we want more school level autonomy. We want to play a role in designing how the school is run. And they are allowed to create the pilot school model that LA Unified has allowed. And you can see a lot of kind of learning and cross-pollination, I think, between these two approaches, where LA Unified is slowly moving in this direction, I think in part in response to the growth of the charter sector. So could LA win the marathon? I mean, I think there's then this question of sustainability going forward, of course, in that it is a slower moving process in LA. And I think the things that would argue that is possible here are the diverse and inclusive network, and when that group comes together as a more cohesive coalition. But in particular, that things here are just simply not as dependent on top-down leadership as they are in New York. That a lot of groups have played a role in seeing these things through. And so shifts at the top, on a day-to-day basis can seem like a big deal, but in the long run, I don't think they matter quite as much. And it is this question of change taking time, which for funders, for philanthropists, is a hard reality to accept. And that's where I'm going to conclude, is sort of with some challenges for philanthropy and for thinking about the interaction between philanthropy and public policy. First of all, with respect to strategic philanthropy, kind of going back to where I started, that is not a framework that's necessarily well adapted for the long term. If you're looking for data and results and you want to have a strategy that's responsive to return on investment, are you going to wait 10 years to make sure that your strategy, is that you've picked a good investment strategy? No, I mean, we're looking generally for shorter term outcomes. Politics is not very conducive to that type of thinking. Secondly, there's this question about where philanthropic investments have been targeted, and there's been this story of targeting to the mayoral or state-controlled districts that have a very particular type of politics, where often you can feel like you're succeeding in the short term and you see a lot of change happen. Sometimes you even see results early on, but there's this question of, I think on the one hand, of learning for the funders. So are they in a position to learn anything about how you could operate in a school district like Los Angeles over the long haul? And that frankly, that characterizes the majority of school districts. Most don't have mayoral or state control. And this question about democratic accountability for funders, like how well can they deal in a more transparent system, or a system where they're going to get more questions about the strategy. And I return to this quote as a final thought that I found over the course of doing my research, but I think the lesson that Casey learned in the early 90s is still really relevant to funders today, that a funder's presence can become an obstacle to local ownership, when in many respects local ownership is actually the goal at the end point, that if you've achieved sustainability, you've also achieved local ownership. So I'll wrap it up here, and I really look forward to your questions and comments.
The most interesting question about all these things is the fashion of charter schools, or of educational reform. And without any much empirical stuff, they always have this, they always bring out their favorite example, but systematically it's much more complex. Mm-hmm. And I think this says something about the philanthropic world. And it goes, by the way, this is not new. This goes back, I remember when Ford was making big investments in the 60s in cities, all right?
Yeah.
And there's very little known, and nor can there be much known when they try to do this. So it's a very interesting problem for foundations, especially when they think in terms of, return on investment, all this evaluation stuff. And what's remarkable is they don't seem to be subject to what I would call self-criticism about their ideological fashions. Is that an unfair way of putting it? You know, their commitments that they, you know.
Yeah.
And it's sort of the head of the foundation or some person who has a lot of money thinks this is the right thing to do. They found the evidence. Is there anybody in this whole business, whether New York, Los Angeles, wherever, is anybody giving them a chance to think twice, so to speak?
That's a great question. I mean, I think you see a little, well, I wouldn't go so far as to say there's that much slowdown in the process or that much extra thinking prior to adopting a strategy. You see a little bit of shift. So I'd point to Gates, where with the small school strategy, they picked it, they went in, they were creating small schools, and then they evaluated, and then they completely changed their mind. With the teacher quality thing, which is the new strategy, it was the agenda, they picked it, and they've really tried to set a national agenda, but they built in a lot more research on the front end. And I think there's a lot that could be asked about, you know, the kinds of questions they're asking in the research and sort of how much they've sort of stacked it with the agenda. But I think there was, it's maybe a slow evolution, but there was some recognition that, well, we better figure out how to really evaluate teachers well before we're gonna say this is our model for evaluating teachers. But they definitely decided we should be evaluating teachers and we should be focusing on teacher quality. They made that decision, but the how took a little more development.
I think one of the things you might study, if you could spend, you know, looking at some of the major funders in this context, is the historical fashions or historical foci.
Yeah.
Because I'm struck by always the, how should I say, the unfaithfulness of them. You know, they change from, you know, you get a new head of the foundation, his job or her job is to fix it, right?
Right.
And I think, in other words, the internal dynamics of the funders might be a very interesting thing to study as a force in which this world operates.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And they bring prestige to ideas, you know, so that's important. They don't seem like interested parties, haha. And then the other thing you might look at, and then I'll stop, is look at ideological opponents. There are some foundations which are against this and have another agenda.
Yeah.
I mean, I cannot believe, you know, I don't know which ones are which, but there must be some that are large that think this is a wrong way to go and have their own way.
There are a few, but the thing in education, what's happened is they've become because of the convergence, their share is much, so Ford, for example, is not really on board with what Gates is doing. And you'd be surprised, right? Ford is big, except that when you take Gates and Broad and Walton and 6 others, Ford looks very small. Yeah. They look like they're more into the. They have a few things. They're into the political organizing aspect to some extent, and then they're very interested in after-school opportunities, so extended learning time. But yeah.
Studying that as a supply-side phenomenon might be illuminating.
Yeah. That's a good idea.
How much convergence is there with federal policy in terms of where the kind of funding is going and who they're funding?
Yeah, it would be, that's some more data I should collect, because if I could add to that 2010 data, particularly, and the network, the investing in innovation grants, that the Obama administration did, there's actually yet another layer of over, and I've talked to some funders about this, and you get really, it's interesting, while they're not necessarily ready to recognize that convergence amongst themselves might have some unintended consequences or might not be altogether good. They're very concerned about overlap with the federal government. So it's very interesting that different perspective, but there is that feeling that, wow, maybe this pooling of resources is kind of over the top because there's very explicit reasons why. You had people from the foundation community going to work in the Department of Education under Obama, and there was a lot of communication and fairly explicit efforts to be aligned. Yeah.
So I think that the convergence of the funding means that nonprofit organizations are receiving diversified funding, right?
Yeah.
So I assume that different funders have different requirements to this organization. So I'm thinking whether the diversification of funding affects the organization themselves, like whether they have conflicts of meeting these requirements.
That's a great question. And I've taught, in my interviews, I did talk to some grantees about that. And I mean, another thing I would add to that is that the funders who are really big proponents of strategic philanthropy often have their reporting requirements get pretty lengthy and extensive. So the grantees have to have a pretty good infrastructure or staff in place in order to provide the kinds of data that the funders want to see. So the Broad Foundation is really known for asking for a lot. So I think, though, what you're saying could work in two ways, because in terms of the diversity of the funders, because part of the alignment story is that there's some similarity in what they expect. A lot of it is about test scores and raising test scores over a certain period of time. So they maybe are not having to meet hugely different objectives for different funders, but from a logistical standpoint, what they have to respond to can be quite a bit and sometimes quite extensive. And I've also had, on the moving less from the charters and the groups that where you'd expect an outcome like test scores, I had some really interesting conversations with advocacy groups that were finding some funders saying, so can you in any way tell us how you might improve student achievement if you want us to keep funding you? And just a lot of frustration that they did not feel like that they should be expected to do that, or that, why are you funding, we do other kinds of work. If you, so I think, again, that's part of the convergence story as well.
I was wondering, do you think that the foundations know who the other funders are?
So do they know that they're, like, if they're giving to Green Dot, that someone else is? That's a great question. I think in many cases, yes, they know. And certainly in New York, with the very kind of coordinated strategy around school reform and the role of some of these nonprofits like New Visions, yes, I think it was actually quite explicit that we're all going to invest here. We have lined up our strategies. Really, Gates and Carnegie were particularly aligned for a while in New York City around small schools and funding several of the similar organizations. Or there seemed to be sort of a coordinated division of labor. So you had the Wallace Foundation play a big role in supporting the principal leadership part. You had Gates and Carnegie. So yes, I think in some, and especially there where there was a lot of, in LA, I'm not always as clear whether there is. Other than that, I think they're drawn to the same groups, like that. Yes, they all like LA Alliance. They are a high performer. We're all going to fund them. But I've not I have not sensed that level of coordination in LA.
There are a couple things. One is they talk to each other.
Yeah.
The foundations do.
Yeah.
The other thing is there are a limited number of nonprofits that are large enough to absorb grants from the large foundations. Because they don't like to make $50,000 grants. So if you're going with a $1 million grant, there's a limited number of potential grantees.
Yeah.
So it works from both
The pressure comes from both sides. Yeah, that's.
I mean, on the same theme, I wonder to what extent you've seen the big foundations funneling money through these sort of ad hoc alliances for giving kind of pass-through organizations that are foundation created and then actually make it harder to trace the money on some of these things because they then redistribute big foundation grants.
There is, yeah, there's some, so part of that is New Schools Venture Fund is an example of that. So I don't have the added layer of then where does New Schools Venture Fund redistribute those funds other than what I draw from their website, that it's mostly charter schools and Teach for America and other organizations like that. But there's an really interesting story about that with the advocacy funding, as small of a pool as it is, and I pick it up, especially when they're giving to some sort of consortium. I can pick it up and code it for what it is, even if I don't know which individual organizations they give to. And an example is there's the Donors Education Collaborative in New York City that was coordinating giving that was going to advocacy groups. And I talked to them a bit about that. I mean, there was this view of needing to shield the funders from the politics of advocacy groups, and the funders really liked this. And maybe for some of the reasons Jim pointed out as well, not having to then redistribute these smaller sums, they could give a lump sum to DEC, to the collaborative, and then they would redistribute.
What was the name of the group?
Donors Education Collaborative. And they were taking in money from Ford and from Gates, I think, for a little while, although I don't think that's been continued. And then some of the New York City-based foundations. But you got interesting dynamics out of that, where you'd have groups that got DEC funding working against mayoral control at the same time that Bill Gates is giving a personal contribution to an organization that supported the continuation of mayoral control, which may be why Gates stopped doing what they were doing there. But yeah, it provided that buffer, I suppose, maybe from the politics, but also from picking these smaller groups to fund. And I've seen that in other examples of that, yeah.
Yeah, ULIT created the California Fund through the Rockefeller Philanthropic Advisors to fund research on education policy work in California.
Okay.
The big grant over like 3 or 4 years. Other questions? Quiet group? Well, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Barbara.
If you or someone else apply that convergence methodology on other issues?
I would love to do that. I mean, the more I've looked at it in education, I have this big question as to, is this unique to education? And particularly because it stands out how quickly.
Talk later.
Yeah, I'd love to.
I got an issue for you.
Okay, because I can't, my hypothesis is that it is somewhat unique. Theirs isn't. Okay, so I really want to talk to you about it because I'm very struck by the pattern, and I'm very interested in the implications of it, but I haven't looked at it in any other issues. Yeah.
I think you probably would see it in implementation of the Affordable Care Act.
Oh yeah, health. Yeah.
Yeah, because there are a number of nonprofits that are in positions to sort of work on exchanges.
Right, but it's a particular, yeah. It's a very different kind of trigger, though, than this, but yeah.
Yeah, the leverage points.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, well, thank you, Sarah.